So what's probably worth talking about is, the idea of what exactly is a bad block. It's kind of a foundational element. And so this session came about partly because of two things. One is an email somebody sent in. It's like, oh, hey, how do you defend around a weak block? And two is because in our last guide, nothing to do with defensive blocking.
Right.
You brought up the idea of your team, I think last season, you had some blocking issues and you had to figure out, well, we need to dig the ball more. So these two things kind of go in hand.
Right.
So what was your situation? What was the blocking problem that you had that you were having to try to address in the backcourt?
Yeah, so really, last season we blocked better. And 2 years ago in our first year, we really didn't affect the ball positively. And I think that that's a really important, blocking gets a bad rap, and I think that it's devalued. I'm neither for or against gold medal squared, but gold medal squared would tell you that their research tells you that blocks per set is the least correlated skill to team success, which is probably true about that specific stat. But I also think that the effect that the block has on the defense is really, really hard to measure. And so empirically, that stat is really...
Let me stop right there, because I actually just the other day ran some numbers on that.
Okay,
based
good.
on the men's 2019 season, the D1, D2 conference, and also D3, and the women, both 2018 and 19, all the way from D1 down to D3. Blocked per set, the correlation that I ran was blocked per set against conference win percentage. So how you do in your league.
Sure.
And blocks per set was not last, actually. And this, the surprising element, perhaps maybe not to some, is that digs per set was actually last.
Yeah.
Which we can kind of talk about in the context of this conversation. So all right, sorry, gold medal square. It's not as bad as people might have been led to believe. But okay, carry on from there.
Which I completely agree with. I think that the measuring, we just have to come up with a different way to measure blocking. And it's interesting because blocking does not have any subsets besides block, assist block, solo block. That's it. Whereas attacking certainly does, where we measure kills, we measure errors, we also measure attempts. And so, if you have your iStat volleyball, they do like blocking efficiency and stuff like that. And some of that stuff can be really interesting if you learn about it and learn how to use it. But basically 2 years ago we sort of got to the point where we were just like, look, we don't block the ball well enough to where when we contact the ball, what percentage of the time is it resulting in a point for our team, whether that's a block, whether that's a dig to transition attack, or even in a positive situation where we're just like blocking it up and the other team gets to recover it, but we're not losing the point, which we consider to be not necessarily the best option, but it was still better than getting tooled and losing the point. And the problem was that more than 50% of the time that we were touching the ball, we were touching it in a way that made it impossible for our defense to recover the ball. And so we had to do a bunch of different things in order to overvalue defense because it was a more controllable skill for our players. In general, in volleyball, the less dynamic a skill is, the more controllable it is. And so digging is a less dynamic skill than blocking. Digging is a less dynamic skill than attacking. Serving is a less dynamic skill than attacking. So the more controllable, the more stable you are, the fewer movements that there are involved in the experience, the more controllable it can be. And so for us, we were clearly having a hard time getting our hand positioning shaped the right way or looking the right way and getting our feet the right way and utilizing our athleticism in a way that was productive on the ball. And so instead of really thinking about it like we have weak blockers, we more thought about it like how can we maximize these blockers into limiting their responsibilities that will then make them into strong blockers, because we have a really solid defensive group. We had a really great training mechanism. I think Laura does a really good job with our defenders, and I think that we were good about training excellent eye work in order to create effective defenders, to be able to read and to be able to understand pattern recognition and so on and so forth. So that's kind of where we landed. And so we basically did whatever we could to create lanes and really limit the amount of creative influence that the blockers had on the decisions that they got to make, whereas the defenders had near limitless possibilities of where they wanted to stand, how they wanted to read, what information that they could process, and based upon scouting reports, so on and so forth. But as blockers, we really were like committed to not allowing our players to maximize their athleticism. And I don't mean not jumping high, but just like there are some blockers who can reach and grab the ball and change the direction of it, and they just have a knack for it. We just didn't happen to have those athletes on our roster. And so in order to keep them and make them effective, we had to update our blocking scheme, and we had to be really committed to our defensive training. How do we do it?
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of different issues that can be at work when we're kind of talking about this concept, because at the very basic level, maybe you're just not tall enough.
Sure.
Maybe that's, in which case, maybe you have the decision, do I block or do I not block? Do I let my middle try to block pin to pin? Or if it's just better who's short or something like that, do I basically let the middle blocker take half the court? And maybe you work on something on the left side to compensate or find some scheme for that.
Right.
Do you go for stuff blocks versus going for touch blocks, depending on how big you are, how big the other team is? And, and to your point, what can we do with a block that maximizes their ability to help the defense without hampering the defense?
Right.
Like you said, how many touches are we getting that are actually positive touches versus, we touched the ball, but it went way off the back of the court or tooled out of bounds or got blocked straight down on the our own side of the court or something like that.
Right.
So why don't we start with the small block side of this, and how we would kind of address the defense behind it in terms of coping with that.
Right. So I think the first is small block is sometimes the most effective block. And because it's specific, it's located, and there's not a lot of movement to it. So I played with a friend of mine in high school. His name was Joe Cho. He was like 5'8", and as we all know, 5'8" in men's volleyball is not big enough to be a middle, but he had incredible timing. You could never see him when you were a hitter, and he just was in the right place. He never blocked the ball straight down. He always blocked it into the corners, and it would go like over the defense and score. But small block doesn't have to mean bad block. It just has to. We just have to understand that it's a job blocker. It's your responsibility to be in this place and to do this specific job. AVCA ran a study in the 90s, and so understanding this data is almost 30 years old. But they ran a study in the 90s saying that in the Big Ten, more than 80% of the volleyballs were crossing the net within 4 inches of the tape. And so I thought that was a really interesting for women's volleyball in Big Ten. And it doesn't mean that they're crossing the net near the blockers. It just means that they're just crossing the net within 4 inches of the tape because the angles that they hit are big and wide. And now I think that data can be extrapolated further because the athletes are just incredible across every division and every level. But I think what it tells us is that if you're a small blocker, you can't leave space between yourself and the net. And so there were some, like what we kind of developed were these non-negotiables. Like it's less important where you are and more important that we are going to ensure that you don't ever break any of these rules. And so rule number one for a small blocker would be you need to have whatever, whether it's your fingertips or it's your hand or it's your arm, needs to be over the net and on their side of the play. If it's not, then you can't be required to block any balls. And in fact, you're just creating a space for somebody to hit and score. And so that was part number one with the small blockers. Part number two is, are they so small that they aren't affecting the block, or do they only get a stuff block? That's a question that I always have for a small blocker. If you can only get stuff blocks, then you're not really affecting the opposing team's attackers except for once out of every 14, 15, 16 swings when you happen to get a block, and sure, it creates a bunch of momentum and everybody's happy for the small blocker, right? But I think truly that it's better for the opposing team to have a sense of where your block is going to be and intentionally hit around it, therefore to your defense, than for you to get a block once out of every 16 times because we're swing blocking for whatever reason so that our little blocker can get from here to here. That doesn't really track to me. And so I think you have to evaluate, is the blocker affecting the ball on every block? And if they're not, then let's get them in a place where they are. And so sometimes people want smaller blockers to take full swing blocks all the time, and that may be helpful for some swing blockers, but then as soon as the tempo of the offense gets fast, they can't keep up and they can't compete. So I would prefer to be static blocking in a situation like that because I at least know where I'm going to have to be. If my blocker is going to maybe or maybe not affect the ball. And so for me, small blockers, they may feel like they want to swing block, and that might get them a house block every however often, 8, 10, 12, 15 swings, or 2 or 3 or 4 matches. But it's not going to be worth it. Our example was Katie Rains. Our first year, she averaged 3.3 blocks per set swing blocking. Our second year, she averaged 0.38 blocks per set static blocking, and our digs per set went from 16 to 19 against, just in the conference. And it was a lot to do with, we just knew where she was going to be. And so teams knew where she was going to be. And so then they said, okay, TWU is setting up their defense on this part of the court, their blocker on this part of the court, so you should be able to hit cross. Well, that was good for us because then you could hit it to our defenders. And so whereas the year before, it was like we're swing blocking and sometimes the line was open and sometimes the cross is open. And that's a good situation if your blocker is affecting the ball. But if they're not, then it's just a crapshoot. So small blockers can certainly be effective, but they have to be on the other side of the net, non-negotiable, and you have to know where they're going to be because a drifting small blocker who's off the net is basically a free point for the other team.
Yeah, I would agree. I think personal philosophy is the block positioning and block timing are such critical elements regardless of who's doing the blocking.
Right.
Because, I've seen situations where the pin blocker and the middle blocker are up. How are you supposed to defend around that? Mm-hmm. Or your block is, flying past the attacker. And there's the theory that, okay, well, the defense will be able to adjust to the position of the block, but that's way overstated. It's way overstated because when things are going, especially at the tempo of the offenses are going these days, you don't have a lot of time to move as a defender. So if you have to guess where your block is going to be because sometimes they're on it and sometimes they're flying or whatever, then you're never probably going to be in the right spot. Or if you are, it's going to be based on blind luck.
Right.
So that's, those are the two things that, I'm trying to, and when you're trying to integrate the two of them, that I'm always trying to consider is how can we make it as predictable? And you've kind of alluded to this for our backcourt to know what our block is going to do it. And that extends even to when you start to get into more tactical considerations are we commit blocking or are we not commit blocking? What are we going to kind of cheat one direction or another? Because that will influence, well, is this going to be a one-on-one, which means I may have to position a little bit different, all that sort of stuff that gets into a different level of consideration.
For sure. And I think in America, we have this idea that blockers should block all the sets. They should block them all. And I think internationally, they are much more comfortable with a solo block that's really productive than a double block that is difficult to play defense around or off the net or reading around. And so a lot of international teams will have their middles specifically block the opposing team's middle and one of the pins and not go both directions. And I think that there's actually some data out there that talks about the effectiveness of blockers against right side hitters when the ball's set 3 feet off the net is just really low, like when the ball's set behind, because that directional movement is hard, and pins, especially at lower levels, left side pins are not trained to block because they a lot of times have too many other things to learn. And so sometimes it's better just letting them be solo because they're going to slow down the middle and create a seam and create a drifting situation anyway. And we talk a lot of times with our teams about, like, you have to assess your own productivity and you have to be able to understand if you're helpful or if you're unhelpful. And then if you're unhelpful, what can you do that is helpful? And it's not just like throw your hands up. It's go grab a tip or play some off blocker or, whatever that looks like. And I think that that's almost just as important as understanding the mechanics of blocking, because if you're not going to be helpful, then you got to get rid of those hands, because those hands can be really dangerous.
Yeah.
Oh, there you are.
All right, let's take the situation where we've got a small setter's a perfect example because that tends to be the position where it happens the most.
Right.
We've got a small block where we know that they're not going to get a lot of effective touches. So when you're talking to your defense behind them, are you basically teaching them to ignore the block and defend like there's no block there?
I think that instead of teaching them to ignore the block, I think, again, this is just like being realistic about what the blocker can do to affect the ball. So the less dynamic the blocker is, the closer to your side of the net they are, versus like being all the way pressed and being 2 feet across the net versus being on your side a little bit. It allows the attacker to hit the ball downward at a higher contact point, more shallow. So like the less effective that your block is from a low perspective, so from a total height, then the shallower your middle back defender has to be, just in general, because they're going to have to defend a ball that's being hit over that blocker into the 1-6 or 6, 1-6 seam, or into 6, which is middle back, or into the space between the right back and the middle back. Then I think really it doesn't come down to what the blocker is doing, but if our eye work is such that we have a really good sense in the back row specifically of where did the attacker come from, what are the attacker's general trends, and where is the ball, because we need to know all three of those things in order to have a general sense of what the best ball that the hitter can hit. If the defenders are working to dig the best ball they can hit by position, which is different than just the best ball they can hit, but by position. If the ball is in front of the attacker on the outside, then and they have to jump into the court, then the best ball that hitter can hit to the middle back is probably a tip to the corner or a roll shot or a swing over the blocker back to one. But if we're doing that by position, we have great eye work and we're recognizing the hitter trends, then I think that we don't necessarily have to say, let's ignore the blocker. But we also can say, this is all that the blocker can do. She can only stop them from hitting the ball 10-foot line. That's a good start. Like, we can play defense around that we can create a shell, or we can create a situation to be effective there. Whereas if we're not looking at the right things and we don't have enough data to know what the hitter's trends are, then we really need to kind of assess whether we're prepared enough to play the match. And let's say we really just don't have the data, then one of the things that your staff, somebody on your staff, or maybe your libero, if you don't have a staff that can do it, is you have to track the first 5 swings for every kid, because they're just going to take what's easy at the beginning of a match. That's just how hitters go about things. They hit the easiest ball that they think they can score on, not necessarily with regard to power, but with what's easiest from an athleticism perspective. And if you can track their first 5 swings, that's what they wanted to do. And then we can take those things away. And so I think that it matters. And I also think that it really is important for us to not operate in a vacuum when it comes to, oh, well, last match she hit every ball line, so we're just going to set up our defense line. Well, there are so many other factors to that. I think that one of the least useful data points that coaches love to use is this, like the heat chart, or where they're going to hit the ball, because for an entire year, our team followed Western New Mexico. And Western New Mexico was a fantastic, scrappy team under Jim, but they always left like maybe a meter of line everywhere they went. And so we would scout their teams, and our kids would be like, they only hit line. We'd be like, well, did you watch any of the other matches? Because that was just what that team gave them. And you have to know what your team is giving them, which then brings me back to it's better to have your block in a place that is useful to your defense than not in a place that changes all the time, and that is uniquely different. Once you can be in a place, then you can add creativity to the experience. But if you can't do what you're supposed to do first, then you can't do whatever you want first. And that's a really hard thing, I think, for athletes, because they just really want to get the ball. And I get that. But
and honestly, some coaches just teach them how to teach them to do that anyway.
Yeah.
Just somebody get the ball.
Yeah. Right.
Which is fine on one level, but it tosses out a lot of team stuff. You know, there should be a sense of responsibility of, well, who do we want taking that ball? And one of the reasons that the digs per set number doesn't correlate as well as other things, it comes in at like 38% or something like that, whereas blocking is into the 40s. One of the reasons digs per set doesn't correlate so well to winning is that, well, there's any range of quality of what a dig is. A ball that gets shanked off the back of the court that somebody has to run down is still considered a dig, but you're not going to get an offensive opportunity out of it.
Right.
But it's counted the same as a ball that's dug perfectly to target, that you can run, three option offense out of. So part of the consideration here is, what is the reason for your defense? What is the objective of your defense? And it's not, okay, maybe at the youngest levels or the least experienced levels, it is simply to just get the ball up and keep the rally going. Fine. Right. Okay. That's the situation where errors tend to drive a lot of the scoring. But when you're at a point where kills drive most of the scoring, your job as a team is to generate your own kills and not just keep the other team from getting kills.
Right.
They go hand in hand, of course, but you need to be able to take your defense and turn it on.
Right. And so defense is not digging the ball, but it's digs to target that matter. Volumetrics does a really good job of quantifying your dig to transition attack hitting efficiency, which I find to be a really interesting stat. And so it really drives what is uniquely different. So from fall of 2017 to fall of 2018, we dug like half a dig more per set, but our dig to transition attack hitting efficiency was up 170 points. And so that to me means that those digs are now targeted digs, and the whole goal of volleyball is to be on offense in system. And if that's not the goal of volleyball, then I think that at the highest level you're going to lose, because you're right. At the youngest level, don't make errors. Just do whatever you can. Don't make errors. You're probably going to win. That's okay. If winning is the goal, which we can have a separate discussion about that another time. But at the highest level, errors are, results are not error driven. They're based upon who's on offense in the best situations the most. And those people will win the game every time. And that's why passing average and passing rating has a high correlation. It's why hitting efficiency has the highest correlation. And so you need to set up your block and your defense, irrespective of what your players think they can do, around how do we get on offense in a good situation. That's the most important thing about how do we set up our block. And if you can block for points, awesome, then do that. Then that's a great way to be on offense without having to be on offense. But the reality is the majority of us outside of the Power Five are in a situation where our block is going to score some points, but should assist in the ease of defense in a way that increases the quality of the dig to target. And if it doesn't increase the quality of the dig to target, then it's an ineffective block touch, or ineffective block even if it went to the person, but maybe it's not the person you wanted to dig the ball. And so that, I think, has to be one of the driving forces around how do we set up our block, how do we set up our defenses, how do we create transition digging opportunities that are going to be to target. And then you have to decide what's to target. And that's going to depend upon your personnel. Like, is your middle a good terminator in transition? If so, then the ball needs to be a little closer to the net. And if not, then don't ever worry about digging it near the net. Dig it to a place where the setter can pick one of the pin hitters and make a good decision. It kind of opens it up a little bit. But if you're a middle-driven offense, like the Lone Star Conference is a middle-driven league in a lot of ways, you have to be a lot more precise. And if you're not, then the block is, even if we get the statted dig, then it doesn't really help you. So I would encourage all coaches to create statistics that are relevant, that are not in the box score as a rule, and track those things that are way more helpful and way more indicative, like targeted digs, like block touches that are positive and block touches that are negative. And even using a point system, you can create a point system that's a 0 to 3 point system that almost every kid can understand for almost every touch. And it's something that we've messed around with, but you can do it for setting based upon the options of the hitter. You can do it for hitters based upon the options of the other team. 3 is a kill, 2 is they're out of system, 1 is they're in system, and 0 is an error. Sometimes it's just really easy, and you just code the rally while you're watching it. Pass, set, attack, block, pass, set, attack, block. And that information is way more, has a much larger payoff than the traditional statistics, I would say.
Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously the gold medal score's on the basis, basically a heat map basis.
Right.
Most of the balls go, it's not actually most of the balls. It's, kind of a plurality of balls go to the middle of the court. Mm-hmm. But actually, Tim and I once did an analysis of the Lone Star, offense. And we found that the balls kind of went in an L shape back into the court to the cross court. Mm-hmm. Wasn't a lot of balls in the middle. So we're like, yeah, well, okay. there's a reason everybody plays perimeter defense in the Lone Star, because that's where the balls go. Right. we didn't have a lot of teams playing middle in the Lone Star. And it's so, as Carl McGowan would famously say, do the research for yourself and figure out. But as Mark Lebedew has said in regards to defense, when you talk about positioning, you want to talk about the player being in a position to make effective digs, like we've just been talking about, digs that can be turned into offense. Not in a position where, they might be able to get that ball, but they have to dive and extend and whatever to get it, and it's a low probability that you're actually going to be able to do anything with it, especially if it means you're giving up good digs in another part of the court.
Right.
So consider that element in the trade-off of not just how you start up the basic structure, but also what you're teaching the players in terms of their read that you talked about before. Right. In this situation, given where the ball's set, the attacker's line of approach, what their patterns are, et cetera, within my general zone of responsibility, where's a position that I need to be in to be the most effective, to generate the most good digs and transition opportunities, versus where might I make the spectacular dig, but it's not going to matter because we're going to give them a free ball.
Right. And I think truly that this kind of goes back to my philosophy that more movement is more opportunities for mistakes. And so we should limit directionality, and we should limit our opportunities for errors in places we can do so. And so when you're setting up your defense around your block and your block around your defense, you should set it up so that your defenders have maybe 2 directions to move, but not 3, maybe left and forward, but not left and right and forward. That's a bad setup for a defender who's not incredibly gifted or really physical. I mean, if you're 6'2", you can make a wrong step and recover. But if you're 5'2" or 5'5", like a lot of the defenders in our league who play DS, then you can't choose incorrectly even for a split second and recover. And so I think that not only do you have to figure out where you want to position your defenders, but you also have to circle some places on the court where you're just going to be cool with losing the point because it's so hard to hit the ball there. And so for me, there's probably a 5x5 corner in every defensive setup that we're going to just say, look, if you can hit the ball over the blocker, downward driven to this corner, you're just going to score points. But you're going to have to do it over Trixie Oche, who's blocking at 10-4. That's fine. Good luck. But you have to be willing as a coach to play probabilities to your benefit and not to the opposing team's benefit. So just because they could hit a ball there doesn't necessarily mean that we need to stand there or near there until they prove that they can consistently hit a ball there. And so when we're setting up defenses, whether it's team by team or whether it's the general shell of your defense, you have to, I think at the very beginning, look at your blockers and say, okay, well, based upon these blockers, which balls can we A, block, B, funnel, and C, which should we give up? And there's something that we should give up. And if you're not giving up something with your defense and forcing the other team to make a play that's outside of their comfort zone on that give up ball, then your defense is just literally can't cover 30 feet of court with the athleticism of today's game and the tempo of today's game. It's just not possible. And so when you're giving it up, you got to think, what can I give up to allow my defenders to move the least in order to play the ball? Because if they can move less, then they can control more. And I think that that's really important. It's important for your team to buy into this idea that these parts of the court, you're just going to be able to score on. And it shouldn't be easy parts. It shouldn't be in the middle. It shouldn't be, on the left back sideline. Those are too easy to hit. But if you hit a ball over my blocker into one and it's within the last 3 feet of the court and my player can dig it, probably they were out of position to be able to dig it. And I'll be like, hey, that's a great dig. What are you doing there? And then if the kid says, well, I just saw that that's where she was going, I'll be like, awesome. That's a great job. But the probability is you're in the wrong place if you're making digs in places that are really hard to hit. And I think that like what you're talking about, that L shape, that last 3 feet of the court in both corners, you're going to have to give some of it up if you want to have an effective defense. You just can't stand in every ball. And I think that that's hard for coaches. I think we really don't like to give credit to the opposing team. We always feel like we could have won the rally. And I think that we really need to, as coaches, we really need to like mediate the fact that the opposing team can make plays too. And that's a respect thing that I think somewhere in the late 90s, early 2000s, we just began to think we can always win the rally. And that's just the thing that's furthest from the truth, especially in rally scoring. You just can't. And having that respect for your opponent, I think, goes a really long way. And it allows the players to accept that there are things that our team can do, and we're going to do those things really well. And there are things that we aren't going to be able to do, and that's okay, because it's just going to put a lot of pressure on the other team. But if we're busy doing the things that we can't do very well as one of our primary functions, then even if we do it, like you said, we're going to dig inefficiently. And that's just as useless, because then the offense is worse over there for us because they're in system. And that's the goal, is they need to be out of system. We need to be in system. Whichever team is more in system wins most of the time, with very limited exceptions.
Yeah. And you talked about the challenge of obviously the standard statistics and even more, when you talk about like rating every touch, because obviously that's well within everybody's capabilities if you're willing to put in the time and effort to do it,
right,
or have the staff to be able to do it. Yeah. We have to always realize that everything is interrelated. So, the setter who sets a 3 off of a 3 pass, okay, that's probably not spectacular. That's what they should do. But if they're able to set a 3 off of a 1 pass, okay, that's a different sort of situation. So one of the things that we have to look at here is, we talked about how do we defend around the block. We've also sort of talked about, well, how do you block with your defense in mind? Mm-hmm. But then the other layer to this is, how can we do things like with our serve? Or if we have to do not a kill attack, but more of a challenge attack, try to put them out of system attack that benefits our block and or our defense. So all of these things get wrapped up together if you're thinking on the right level about it, saying, okay, well, I've got a defender in 6 who's fantastic going side to side, but I know we don't want her to take the forward ball, like you said, 2 directions, not 3.
2 directions, right?
Yeah. So we're okay if we get loopy balls to the corners, because she's going to be able to run those down. Mm-hmm. What we don't want is that ball hit 20 feet in the middle of the court, because she's not going to dig that. And we have other players in other positions of responsibility. So somehow as a block, we need to figure out, we're going to take that particular area of the court away, which sounds great in theory until you get a big bomber who can hit over the top of your block or in your high seam or whatever and still hit that spot. And now you go, okay, well, how do we stop that swing from happening? Well, okay, maybe we have to serve that player to force them deep so they can't get the set. Or we have to serve to 1 because the setter then doesn't set that ball or whatever.
Right.
So it's, you start getting into 3rd and 4th level considerations and all this stuff, but that's the game.
Mm-hmm. And it's much better to look at blocking as like special teams in football than as offense or defense. I don't really think that blocking is necessarily offensive, and I don't really think that blocking is necessarily defensive. I think that it's like this special skill that helps you win the field position battle. And as we know, like if we're fighting, volleyball is really this tug of war where the center is neither team is in nor out of system. And the further that we said on one side or the other, that team's more in system and the other team is more out of system. And those things are completely correlated. There's not really a time where one team's in system and the other team is also in system, except for at the highest levels. And even then, they're still correlated, and the differences in winning and losing are micro inches instead of inches, right? Mm-hmm. But blocking is less offensive and less defensive because it can be offensive if you score, and it can be defensive if you produce a dig or if you produce a positive block touch, is what we would call it in our gym, or a 2-option block if you want to use your 0 to 3 scoring method, where a 3 is a kill block and a 2 is a positive touch and a 1 is a negative touch and a 0 is a blocking error. We're in the net or under or some other thing happened. But blocking is really this unique skill that mediates offense and defense and affects both, but isn't really either. Because if you block and you're just like putting your hands up, then it's totally not an offensive skill, but it's also not really a defensive skill. And if you're really active and you're really trying to get the ball, well, it's a little bit more offensive. But if you don't get the ball, then it turns into a defensive part of your defense. And so I think we have to look at blocking, I think, from the perspective of where do I set up my block? How do I set up my block? How do I set up my defense in order to win the field position battle, not in order to create more block kills or solo blocks or assist blocks or however you want to language it, and also not to increase our dig total. Like, neither of those things are good blocking goals. The blocking goal should be relative to what your best option is for your team. And it's going to be field position based. And you're going to have to think of it, I think, truly in not a function completely of defense and not in a function of completely of offense. And like you're saying, that's the second and third level of volleyball, but really it's also the first level. If you have kids who can understand that all you have to do is win this field position battle over the long haul, you're probably going to win matches, whether or not they do anything else right. And they're always consistently making decisions to put the other team out of position. And same with your coaching staff, based upon your serving zones, your game plans, or your out of system roll shots go to this place, or your free balls go to this place. Those are all contributors to this game of tug of war that we all love to play, but especially in rally scoring. And it just was not as important when it was standard scoring. You could just, they were in system and then you were in system, and we just side out until somebody gets another one. And in rally scoring, you just can't do it. You just can't win every contact. You can't win every touch.
Right. All right. Let's talk a bit about training. So, and we can start with the block side of it.
Okay.
What's your approach to training your block to do what they need to do versus to just freewheel and I'm just going to go for the block on every single situation, defense be damned?
Yeah. So we start with the hardest ball to dig to me is the ball hit between the line defender, whomever that may be, and the middle back defender. That's the hardest ball to dig, because you can hit it with extreme power, no matter if you're on the left pin or the right pin, and you're inevitably hitting a ball into a space that has to be moved into. Very rarely do you see teams that set up their base in the two seams in middle back and in middle front anymore. We don't see a lot of middle up defense at the highest level any longer. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It might be a great idea for your team, but again, we just don't see it very often. And so personally, we talk about, we want to make sure that our opposing team does not hit the ball into a space with power that we have to move into. That's a recipe for inefficient digs, as you've put it, right? So we set up our block. We really consistent. Our inside hand is on the ball. And it doesn't mean that you can't try to block the ball, but whether you're static blocking or whether you're using a crossover step or whether you're like modified swing blocking or whatever that looks like, That's how our block has changed. And from year 2 to year 3, we became really specific about what the blocker's responsibility is. And we do not want the ball to be in the air for less time. And so we feel like the longer the ball's in the air, the better opportunity we have to make a play, which therefore means if it can be hit cross in any capacity, we have a better chance to dig it. And if we can encourage roll shots line or tips line, then our line defender will have a better chance at defending it. That doesn't mean that that's absolutely correct. It doesn't mean that that's how we always do it. It just means that that's where we start. And we call that a 0-0-0 block. We define where we're starting as blockers based upon what is our base, and that's going to be called 0-0-0. And that way we can move our left side blocker one step to the left by saying -1, or one step to the right by saying +1. And we can do a +1-0-0 if we want to pinch the middle, or if we want to spread out, we can do a -1 or a -2 on both pins. But it gives us a starting place. And obviously, those starting places have to be flexible based upon the team. And it's really important to teach your athletes how to line up their hands, outside hand or inside hand, or the space between, on the correct position of the ball. That might be the most important thing for your defense, is how do we get into the right place at the right time? Then this past season, we've adopted a John Speraw concept, which has paid off pretty large for us. He did a study in a conversation at convention in 2019, so December 2019. Nope, that's wrong, 2018, where USA Volleyball basically researched the 15 best international blockers on the men's side. And they decided that based upon their eye work, after the ball was set, they weren't looking at the hitter basically at all. They understood where they needed to put their hands on the inside or on the outside, or, wherever that looked like. But they weren't spending nearly as time going ball setter, ball hitter as all of us coaches would like to think. It doesn't mean that this is the automatic, this is going to fix your blocking. You have to have a certain level of athleticism to be able to play this way. But we did this fall, and we updated our blocking eye work to be ball hitter setter, because you have to have a sense of where they're coming from, the hitter. And then after the ball is set, we're watching the ball until right before the contact. Because your brain is really smart. All of our brains are really smart, and they can connect the starting place to the ball in our heads. So if we know the angle of approach, we don't have to watch the angle of approach. And this is really, it was counterintuitive. I hated it at first. I'll wear that. But from a training perspective, it paid off huge. We ended up blocking more balls and positively touching more balls because our hands were almost always in the right place. And we broke the blocking record at TWU on 3 separate occasions this season. We broke every blocking record for the school, and it had nothing to do with us being significantly better at jumping higher. It had everything to do with where our timing was and what our place was. And that had a lot to do with our eye work. It doesn't mean that you can't be in the right place if you're looking at the hitter. I think that that's important, but I'd just say that for our players, it resonated better for them to know the angle of approach and to match it up with where the ball was and to get in front of that location. And that was consistent with what Coach Speraw said they were doing on the men's level. And they give them these cool glasses that can track, what they're looking at and stuff like that. And that's what they found. And I think at the higher levels of athleticism, where people, if you don't block the ball, it's within 3 feet of the net, then it's a point for the other team. Then that worked out for us. It might not work out for you if you're in high school, or if you're a smaller block, or even if you can see it, you shouldn't be there. Even if touching it is not, you're going to make it worse, then maybe we need to say, hey, we're just setting our block on the pin. That's okay. We're going to make sure they hit it to our defense. And we're going to stand over here. That's all right as well. But for us, that adjustment was a huge change, and it paid off. I mean, I think we finished in the top 15 in Division II this year for blocking. And Trixie Oche specifically went from 0.68 blocks per set to 1.1, which is almost double. And that's pretty solid for an individual.
It's amazing what getting the players to think about positioning can do. Because my last year at Midwestern, we had a certain big right side blocker.
Sure.
Who later became a middle. She had come from a school of position blocking. Coach tells me, take X, take line, take cross, whatever. And our approach was not that. We wanted her to take the hitter, to be able to read the hitter, more or less like a defender is meant to read the hitter. And, using the proper eye work, get in a good position to effectively take away their strongest swing, to take away the thing that they want to do.
Right.
Which at the end of the day, that's more or less what you're trying to do with defense. You take away the thing that they're the best at, that they want to do the most, and force them to do other things that are lower percentage for them.
Right.
And that are thus are better percentage for you. It was a fight, because taking a part of the court for the blocker is dead simple. You just go in a spot and you stand there and you jump straight up, more or less.
Yeah.
There really isn't a lot of, okay, maybe you have to make an adjustment for an inside set or an outside set. But beyond that, there's not a heck of a lot going on.
Right.
When you're starting to get them to be more dynamic, now they've got to consider, okay, what's the quality of the pass? Where's the approach angle? All the other things. And I like the funny thing about ball setter, ball hitter was it never picks up where the origination point is, unless you add hitter, ball setter, ball hitter. Right. Then it just gets, now you're starting to get things, this long string of responsibilities. But I like the fact that ball, hitter, setter, I like that, because now that the hitter is in the middle of all that, and your understanding of what to do is deeper. And I always did wonder if blockers really did get to the point of watching the hitter at the end. It's a lot easier for a defender to do than it is for a blocker, to be honest.
For sure. And so we have not changed it for our defense, for our defenders. But I would say that in a situation where we're doing ball hitter, setter, ball hitter, which is like what the ideal, for the last 30 years we've been telling our kids, they never check their hitter, because we know this because crossing patterns work in powerful volleyball. And they should never work. It should be like a banned substance. It's, like they don't, that's the reason why in men's volleyball it doesn't work, because they're already standing there. And in order to set the ball high enough on a crossing pattern, it's too slow at that point. And so everybody's just there, and then it's a block every time. But we know crossing patterns work in the highest level of Division I. And so that means that we're not checking our hitter anyway. And so when if we're looking just at our hitter, we don't have a reference point for the ball. And so we can't connect the two data points, or we don't follow the instructions. And so now we're just looking at the ball like we weren't supposed to be doing, but we don't know where our hitter came from. So now we don't have two reference points either. So we set up our hands on the ball, but we don't have their angle of approach. So it's really easy to hit around. Whereas if you check the hitter, you know where they're coming from, then it's the exact same as like a middle who's talking to her setter while she's going to hit. It's way easier to set that middle, because I have two reference points. I have the ball that I'm holding, and I've got the middle's voice, which she's talking to me. And so my brain is smart enough to connect two things. But for so long, we've been asking our players to connect, to create a line out of a single data point. And I think that that's a very telling reason why the best players don't at the men's level. Now they're checking, they know where their hitter's coming from, because in men's volleyball, they only come from three places. They come from the outside, they come from the right side, they come from the middle, or they come from the back row. Those are the only places that they come from. And so they already know where the hitter's coming from. And so now they can connect those data points every time. And so it makes them more effective blockers, because what you're talking about is they're not being in positions, they're not blocking line, and they're not blocking cross, and they're not really blocking ball. They're blocking the ball that hitter can hit in that situation. And that's the highest level of volleyball. Because as Karch would say, in live pattern recognition determines highest level of success. And so if you can understand in this specific situation what's happening and make a play for that situation, that is better than this is the play we make on all situations. And I think that that's the hardest thing for training. And you can only achieve that if your players understand A, what their eye sequencing looks like, B, what the role of the block is, because if your role is to funnel, then you need to funnel. And if your role is to score, then you need to score. And if your role is to take the hardest ball, then you need to take the hardest ball. You have to understand that at their core. And they have to believe in the success of their abilities. And you have to, as a coach, sometimes you have to validate a dig that is only made possible by the blocker doing their job. And I think that otherwise blockers truly get bored and they lose focus. And if they're doing the right things, they should be celebrated almost every time we get an easy breadbasket dig, because that means that we got the hitter to utilize their third or their fourth swing. And because their first or their second swing, the hitter felt like they were going to lose. And so I think as coaches, we oftentimes are less apt to notice the causality of how great the block was when the block doesn't touch it. And so that would be an important thing for me if I was starting from scratch, or if I'm training a blocking sort of sequence. And it would be important for me if I was a player. I would want to know that I did that. Or like a middle who pulls the blocker and creates a seam, an outside who can connect with the middle and be like, hey, thanks. I appreciate that. That outside is a better teammate than the outside who cheers really loud and is super excited because she just did something, but she didn't think about why she was able to have that situation. And I think that defenders who appreciate their blockers makes the blockers work harder, and coaches who appreciate their blockers, when they don't score points, it makes them commit better to their role in that situation.
Yeah, that's always the challenge of blocking. Is it's the thing that you have the least measurable success doing, because you're only ever going to get maybe a handful of points on a good day. You're going to get a handful of points per set out of your blocks. Mm-hmm. But if you can tie other things into that feeling of success for the block, for the defense overall, then now it's not this thing like, I have to do it. I know I have to do it, but it's only going to feel good one time out of 10. Something like that. So definitely important. All right, let's flip things around to the defenders.
Okay.
How can we teach them to read, as we've talked about, to be in the best position, the most effective position?
So I think as a coach, you first have to decide who's in charge of deciding. So the more youthful your team is, or the more immature your team is from a volleyball pattern recognition perspective, the less flexibility your team should have. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be working toward greater flexibility, but it means that if a player is just learning for the first time that they should be looking at the hitter as a back row defender or as an off blocker defender while the ball is being attacked, then they are not also going to be able to assess that situation and say, okay, well, it's not really here. It's like 3 feet this way. That's too hard of a move. I liken it to this. When I was a baseball player growing up, I come from a baseball family, and my grandfather played for the Cubs and for the Cardinals. And at the beginning of every year, the professional baseball players who are like the Gold Glove players, they would just go to their position and they would just stand there, no glove, and they would just point left and right and straight and at themselves as the bat was being swung, where the ball was going to be according to where they were standing. And usually, according to my grandfather, who was pretty decent, they would do at least 10,000 a day for the first 12 days of training camp. And I think that this is actually a very valid exercise for athletes to learn how to read without the pressure of having to make the play. Because I don't think that at first you can both make the contact and read and feel good about both of them as you're learning the process. It's too hard. And like you might make the wrong read and make the wrong contact, or you might make the right read and make the wrong contact. And so now you end up feeling worse about a situation when you should just be learning one or the other and then learn to put them together. And so the more mature your team is, the more time you can spend on situational reading. And so you want to practice it in 3 capacities to me. The first is open net. I think open net is the easiest means to learn how to read a hitter because you don't have obstructions as you're looking at the hitter. And as is true in everything, you want it to be as live as possible for your gym. Sometimes as live as possible is a coach on a box. Sometimes as live as possible is a player on a box. Sometimes as live as possible is hitters hitting off of a toss. Sometimes it's hitting off of a set. But I think reading open net with some instructions to whoever the hitter is great. It's a really important first start. And there's going to be some time in a volleyball match where you basically feel like you're open net, even if there's a blocker up. The second is you need to learn how to read around one blocker because this actually happens way more frequently than I think we as coaches would like to admit, where we're playing one blocker and 5 defenders. We don't like to admit that, but the reality is if the opposing team setters are good at all, then it happens a lot. And even if your middle is really disciplined about jumping where she is, or like you just get to as far as you can and you plant and press and you play in the hole, you're still basically blocking a ball that's not likely to be hit unless it's a tip or a roll shot or something like that. So we want to practice against one blocker, and we want to be able to see in our peripherals with our soft eyes is a term that we use a lot. We want to be looking at the hitter, but we want to have soft eyes for the blocker, because if we don't know where our block is, then it's very likely that we're going to end up taking the same ball as the blocker, and we don't want to do that. And then we definitely need to read around 2 blockers, and you could do that with live blockers. You can put some kids on some boxes and tell them line and cross and seam, and make them move on the net, which I really like. So that way we're saving jumps, because we all know that whatever the appropriate amount of jumps is, we're all way past it in practice. Vert has been telling us for probably 3 years that the appropriate amount of jumps per day is somewhere between 60 and 80, and I would be shocked if any of us are near it. And so we need to be intentional about saving them and using them effectively. And then, I think it comes down to digging fundamentals, which I think is a different podcast, a different webinar, different posture, position, platform. That's all different. But I think from training a defense to read, I think if you don't start with what does it mean? What types of cues are we looking for from the hitter? And then also tie that into what you know about that hitter over the course of the year. And don't use a heat map, but use a pass percentage. So if you go in and you say, hey, when their team passes a 1, let me look at all the swings for this hitter. When their team passes a 2, let's look at that. When their team is in system passing a 3 with a middle option, let me look at that, because those situations are really different by the hitter. And most hitters can hit with power 2 balls and have one really good tip or a roll shot, but usually not both. And you just have to know what that tip or roll shot is. And the elite hitters have a tip that is a short tip and a deep tip that functions on the same person, and a roll shot that's short and deep that's on the same person. But it's very, very rare, unless we're talking about Olympic or international level, that they're going to have all of those swings. And so when we're talking about reading, we not only have to read the current situation, but we should know in the back of our head what the trends are. And early in the season with our defenders, we ask them to keep a journal and to update it at the end of every day with what do you know about your hitters? So that way in our gym, we know our players. And it helps because A, it helps us call the right things in matches because we know what their best moves are. And B, it helps us defend the right way in practice to keep stretching our offense and making them, okay, I can't hit that short roll shot anymore in my gym because it's always dug because my left back can see it. And so I think that we need to do a better job as coaches kind of explaining that you can have a perimeter read offense or a rotational read defense, rotational read defense. And you can have a middle up read function to things. And how much reading goes on is dependent upon how mature of thinkers and how good at pattern recognition the defenders can be. And some of the kids early in the year are not allowed to move, and some of them are allowed to go wherever they want. And that's the reality of Morgan Hens. You know, she could just be wherever she wants. That's fine.
Right. Now, first thing before I continue on with some thoughts of my own, I'm completely stunned that we're an hour and 8 minutes into this thing and not a single question has been submitted. I don't know if that means you guys are completely enthralled by what we're talking about here and we're covering everything that you had a question about, or what. You're scared? Come on, if you're scared, go ahead, submit a question. No big deal. We're not, going to bite your head off or anything like that. The two things that I would bring up is, as a coach, when you're working on this individual defense and positioning, you have to be behind the defender or as close to behind the defender to be able to see the same things that they see as you can. Because it's really hard if you're on the other side of the gym and the kid wants feedback to know what they could have seen, did see, should have been looking at, whatever. Like, why is Susie behind the block? Okay, you may not even be able to tell if you're in the wrong position that she was actually behind the block, but she knows, and she's looking at you going, what did I do wrong? And you're just like, I don't know. Unless you've got video, which is always great too.
Well,
get that replay up there.
Really fast right there, because I think that there's something that we do in our gym that John Dunning did in his gym that I haven't seen anywhere else except for at a live practice. Every kid that's in line to dig should be reading and making the same movements behind. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's because as coaches, we can't always be behind the exact defender. But if the defender makes the read this way and the person who's off, everybody else goes this way, well, then now you have three people who can tell this kid, hey, you're not looking at the right things because we all knew it was going over there. Right. Or this kid gets the dig and these three kids are over here and we get to stop the drill and be like, hey, what are you guys looking at? Because she got a dig.
Yeah.
And she was the only one who went that direction. And I think that it really active, engaged players who are off changes the amount of touches they get, even if they're not actual touches. And that's a way to maximize the gym. So I didn't mean to cut you off, but
no. I think that's a very important kind of like a neural development point. There's research out there that you don't have to actually be in the play itself to learn from the play. You can do the shadowing. You could do it in service eve. You could do it in defense. You could do it with blocking, whatever. As long as you're getting the same visual cues, you're doing the same thing you would do on the court, perhaps without the actual physical movement. So it's a valid thing. The other thing I was going to get into was at a certain point, to be truly effective as a team on defense, we all have to read the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we don't want is a situation where two players are going for the same ball when clearly there's one player you want taking that ball and one player you don't. And okay, if it's back row players, if it's between 6 and 5 and they're both going for the ball, that's probably not a big deal, unless for some reason it messes with your offense, with your pipe attack or something. A more obvious consideration is, say, between your right side and your setter. Mm-hmm. You obviously want your setter to take as few balls as possible, so you don't want them going for a ball that the right side attacker can take. You want them releasing into a position, because if they end up going for the same ball and either the setter ends up having to take it or they don't take it, but they're so committed to it that now they can't make the penetration move, now you're back to, okay, yeah, it might have been a perfectly good dig in terms of it was high enough, it was in the right location, but you don't get anything out of it because your setter's effectively out of the play. Mm-hmm. So that's when kind of winding back to that very first part of what we're talking about is somebody just get the ball. That's really puts a ceiling on what you can do as a team defensively.
Yeah, and it comes down to understanding what your roles are. And I think the best way that we describe it, or we've started to describe it, is maybe just from a service perspective. So if you think about the court, it's 9 meters or 30 feet, wherever you're listening from. And we assign spatial allocations to our service receivers. So our libero last year was a good kid, but she had 2 herniated discs. And so during her junior year, she had 16 feet of court that she was allowed to pass. And during her senior year, it was 12 because she couldn't move as much. Well, the same thing needs to be true. And all you have to do is just get up to 30, right? So my libero is 12 and my outside is 10 and my other outside is 8. Okay, well, now we're in good shape. We can pass the whole court. But if my outside can only really pass 4 feet of court, then I might need another passer. And there's nothing wrong with that. And those two people can pass 4 feet and 4 feet, 12 and 10. Great. Now we've got the whole court covered. The same thing needs to be true defensively. And you have to have an understanding of how much is your responsibility and how much directionally freedom do you have. And you want to set yourself up on the edge of whatever direction, not in the middle. Because again, the movement options should be 2 or fewer, not 2 or more. If I'm a middle back and I set up my defense in a situation where the block is closed and I'm going to start on the outside of the block and I have to go left, forward, or right, I'm not going to do any of those things very effectively. And so I need to have an understanding of how far can my left back read into, and therefore what's my responsibility as the middle back as far as which balls that hitter can hit. And so those are the how do we read together situations where that she's responsible for these swings and I'm not responsible for them. And they're really specific. It's not just a space on the court, but it's up and down or driven or it's a tip, and they're really specific. And so I would encourage you to kind of walk player by player through your defense and kind of define what that player's capabilities are, because I think it will help them in the long run understand whose job is whose, and it'll end up freeing them up instead of hampering them.
Mm. And you have to think a lot in terms of process here when you're doing the training, because as with working with hitters, okay, they might get a good swing, but they're not doing the things that you want them to do. Maybe their footwork wasn't right, or you want them to attack line. They still got to kill by attacking cross court because the defense made an error or something like that. Players are going to make good digs in bad positions. Mm-hmm. Okay, it may work out in the short term, but you should know that in the long term, it's not going to be beneficial for your team, and you need to train them to understand that, and the rest of the team too. Right. It's kind of like what we talked about with the blocking. Encourage the blockers to do the right things, by having everybody supporting them and indicating the level of success that the team is having because they funneled the ball or they got the soft touch even though it wasn't a stuff. You know, if a defender is in the right position but doesn't make the play on the ball because some freaky thing happened, you know, went off the block in a strange way, or they hit this one specific spot that would have been a miraculous dig, like going to the one corner,
right.
you know, we can't let them feel bad about it. We can't let their teammates feel bad about it because we don't plan for them to make that play. We have to make sure that they're doing the plays that we need them to make. And if they happen to make the other play, okay, fine. But you don't celebrate, just move on.
Right.
Okay, let's get on to the next one and focus our energies on developing the things that we know are going to have the biggest element of contribution to our defensive efficiency.
Well, and I think too that we have a much bigger responsibility as coaches than we realize for drill running. I am neither for or against blocked practices as a blanket rule. I am neither for nor against random practices as a blanket rule. There are times where blocked training is the right way to do it, and there's times where it's not. There are times when everything should have 3 contacts, and there are times when you shouldn't. And so I don't want to wade into that conversation. What I do want to say is I think that as a college coach, I show up in a lot of club gyms where the team plays perimeter defense, but the coach does not hit perimeter defensive balls in a drill. And so there's no base to defense movement requirement. Now the kids aren't really getting to their sideline. They're sort of just turning. And that might be fine. That might be the defense you want to play. But then you can't talk about them playing perimeter if you are training them to not move, because that's not perimeter. It's just, 3 across. Which is in and of itself a defense. And that might be where you should be. But I think that as coaches, we oftentimes are like, we're just hitting it and it gets shallower and shallower and shallower and shallower. And then I think especially if we have a perimeter shell that we're supposed to be reading out of, we end up reading the closer you are to the block, the harder it is to get outside of it. And so it really causes some major issues. And as coaches, we have to be really aware of what our training mechanisms look like. And if we want to train effective blocking, we can't just toss the ball into the space between the box and the net and hit it. We have to hit it from on and from off and from out and from in. We have to, when we play defense, we have to hit it from on and from off and from out and from in. And that's just the reality of our responsibilities as coaches. And you might have to block train it because you can't take 95 jumps with your team. That's real. That's fine. That makes sense to me. But you also can't say you want to do one thing and then forget what your training goals were when you're training it. And I think that happens to coaches way more than we want to admit, where we're like, we need to be better at playing perimeter defense, but I'm not going to think about where I'm hitting the ball from this box. I'm just going to hit it to that player. And then we get into a game and we wonder why kids can't defend on those situations you're talking about, where just because we think what should happen doesn't happen, it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have the responsibility to dig it. It does mean that as coaches, we have to figure out how to train weird spin, not perfect arm swings, not low arms, like the coach's arm and stuff like that. We got to give our kids every training tool, and we have to train the same skill from 95 different positions. We have to train 95 different positions with different skills. And so I think that that's one of the things that is hardest about defense, because as coaches, we've hit so many balls, we can hit them the right way. And as players, they've hit significantly fewer balls than us, and they all have their own tick. They all have their own mechanics that are slightly different, and that mechanical difference cannot mean that we shouldn't be able to dig. And so as coaches, we need to be able to hit the ball in weird ways, and we need to be able to hit the ball in the right way and the wrong way and with a flutter in our hand. And we got to be able to think about defensive positioning so that in a way that creates a Rolodex of, this is my situation. Okay, and then just scroll toward low arm. Okay, here's the low arm situation. Oh, I need to stay a little deeper in the court. Got it. Like, whereas if you just do what you always do, then if they see something else, then they won't have the information necessary to make a true read.
Yeah. Yeah. And one important thought came up while you were talking about that is in terms of, we talked about in any defense, there's going to be a spot that we're giving up. The traditional spot in the rotation, in the perimeter defense is basically the middle of the court. We don't have anybody assigned to the middle of the court.
Mm-hmm.
So if a ball drops there, we have to accept that that's the open area and not get angry that nobody got that ball, because we don't have somebody to get that ball. If somebody's getting that ball, that probably means they're not in the position they're supposed to be. So if you start punishing the team for not taking balls that they're not meant to take, then you're actually encouraging them to break the system that you're trying to put in place, which is completely counterproductive.
Mm-hmm.
And to the point about, swinging off different attack angles and things like that, for a while when I was, a college coach coming up, when we would work on defensive drills, it was always the coaches hitting, almost always the coaches hitting.
Mm-hmm.
Because we could control the ball, we could put it where we wanted to, we could hit it as hard as we want to, all that sort of stuff. But realize that there's value in having the players hitting, specifically because they don't have the control that you do.
Right.
They're going to introduce a random element. So your defenders, if you're attacking, a lot of times, and this is what you're talking about, the coach hitting the ball straight at the player, right where they're supposed to be. And okay, if you're trying to get them to be where they're supposed to be and maybe they're not, and you hit it at the ball where they're supposed to be and they don't make the dig, okay, coaching point. But the players are getting into this habit of digging this ball that's hit with perfect topspin straight in their lap. Okay, good dig. Everybody's happy. They move on. Somebody else steps in. But they're not learning to dig the ball that's hit with no topspin that comes floating at them straight at their chest, or is, a foot to the side, or is a foot too short, or whatever. And with power differentials all over the place. And so you go, okay, yeah, my drill does not run as nicely and neatly as it would if I had my two assistants up there banging the ball. But the players are probably getting more out of it for every rep than they would have otherwise. Obviously, taking into consideration, we don't want to overwork shoulders and all that sort of stuff. But, don't push aside effectiveness of training and development for neatness of what your drill looks like.
Yeah, and also the trade-off for drill running to coaching exists, whether you want it to or not. You could have great eyes. I could be able to hit a ball without really, really looking at it and looking pretty much at the defender, but I'm going to be able to be a better coach if I'm not running the drill. That's for sure true. And so I think we want to be involved. We want to feel like we did something as coaches. That's always like part of the deal. Like, man, I was a little sweaty after practice. Yeah, I really did a good job. But did you? Or did you do all the job and your players didn't do enough of the job? And that doesn't mean that your players need to be the ones to hit, but it does mean that, like, when you're setting up your defense, if you're not planning for randomness, then you're not planning for defense. That's just the reality of it.
Yep. Okay, we still haven't gotten any questions, which is just completely blowing my mind. I don't think this has ever happened.
That's all right. What's that? Maybe we should just turn it over and see if anybody has any real quick. And then if you think of anything else, I'd be glad to walk through it. Otherwise, we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, right. I mean, I was just going to say, if there's anything that you can think of that we haven't addressed yet, feel free to bring that up, and it'll give people a little bit of time to maybe type something in.
Yeah, I guess my only true thing that we haven't talked about is really just, I think I should answer the question, why did we try to do something that nobody else is doing in our gym? And because nobody's doing ball setter or ball hitter, setter, ball. Like that's just not, it's not something that people say. Like you go to any high school in the country that's doing a decent job and they're all saying ball setter, ball hitter.
Ball setter, ball hitter. Mm-hmm.
You go to any college program in the country and most of them are saying ball setter, ball hitter. At the highest level, they're probably not talking about it anymore. They're probably just like, you need to block the freaking ball. And the answer to that for me was you need to, as a coach, if you're not completely open to getting it right rather than being right, then you are missing a window for growth. And so do I think that this is the only way to train blocking? No, I definitely do not. Because I coached at Illini Elite, which is part of the sports performance system, which you could feel however you want to about that. But I can tell you that those kids in our system were incredibly well trained. They did the right things all the time, and we did ball setter, ball hitter for a decade, and it worked. And when I was at Coastal Georgia, we did ball setter, ball hitter, and it worked. And we averaged almost 3 blocks per set, and we're in the top 5, and that stuff was valuable. And then we got to Texas, and it not only didn't work, but we were touching the ball poorly, and I don't think it has anything to do with Texas people. I think it has to do with the athleticism is a little different here in a really good way. And also what we were saying wasn't resonating with the athlete, whether we wanted it to or not, whether I thought I was right or not. And I still think that I've coached a certain way for 17 of my 18 years about blocking, and it was always fine. But I just think we need to, as coaches, always be working toward getting it right instead of trying to be right. And so when it was our second year in a row of being in the middle bottom of the league and for blocking, and also recognizing that, like you said, measuring the correlation of blocking is near impossible, right? And then we just throw out what you used to know when it doesn't work. You don't just have to keep banging your head against the wall. Try something new and be willing to go with it. And what's the worst that happens? If it didn't work for us, we could have gone back to what also wasn't working for us at any time. So I think that as coaches, sometimes we just get locked into this thing, and telling your kids ball hitter, setter, ball might not work with them or fix it or do anything different or whatever. Setting up your block in a location might be better for your team. Setting your block up around the ball might be better for your team. But honestly, it is critical that we don't just think that whatever answer we have is the only answer. Because if volleyball has taught us anything in the last 30 years, is that there's something new to invent. And there's something new that's going to change. And even a tiny rule change can have huge ripple effects upon what's going to happen. And it's up to us as coaches to invent the new stuff. It's not football. It's not baseball. It hasn't been around forever where everything's been discovered and this is how to do it. And I think that we really need to, especially with this types of statistics that you utilize, you have to invent things. You have to. So that's where I would land. Go ahead.
All right, we got one request for clarification. So it's ball hitter setter ball, right? That's the sequence.
Yes.
Okay, good, got that. All right, we have another question. This I suppose probably relates a little bit more to offense, but I want to know, should I train a tall middle with good hands to become a backup setter option for when I come up against a strong outside hitting team? I'm not sure where the strong outside hitting team element of that comes in, but maybe we can address it. The thing I would say is there somebody else who would be a better option that might be able to keep your middle hitter as an attack, as an attacker? If not, then maybe your middle is the better option. You got any thoughts on that?
whatever these are the questions that people don't like my answers about, because it's not that I'm not answering your question, so I apologize in advance, but whatever the best offensive option is for your team, regardless of who's setting the ball, is who should set the ball. The best thing for your team is to be on offense in system. So if your middle has great hands and can set the right side and the outside, then do it. The place where I'd be concerned would be if at any point you have an out-of-system setter who can only set one option, because then you're giving away everything. Even if it's a great ball, you're giving away too much information to the opposing team. It's too easy to block when you know which way you have to go. And so if your backup setter is able to set the outside and the right side, or the outside and the back row attack, then do it. And if your libero is your better option, do it. If your right front is a better option, do it. I mean, Jason Scotch at WT had those right fronts running quicks when the setter dug, with kids who had never set before. And he just trained it. They worked on it in their pre-serve warm-up, and he was great at it. They did a great job with it, and it was absolutely terrifying. But if it didn't work, it was bad. And so whatever your best option is to run good offense is the right option, regardless of if you should train them or you shouldn't train them. That's going to be kid by kid, team by team to me, more than anything else.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. In the olden days, the right sides very often were the secondary setter.
Yeah,
in the olden days, and some of them could run the middle quick quite effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Even when I coached at Brown, which wasn't the biggest powerhouse offensive team in the world, we would have right sides who could do it. When I coached in England, my second season there, we had a former setter who was our right side hitter, and we had a particularly good middle attacker next to her. So I was perfectly happy with her taking second ball to be able to set, the middle.
Mm-hmm.
But that was those teams in those situations. So do you have a libero who can step in and is like one of the Brazilians and can run a shoot set from the 3-meter line? Then you probably want to let her do that, and keep your right side attacker as an option. But look at your personnel.
And I would say, and this is coming from a setter, if you have a setter who's got moves as a hitter, then one of the most effective things you can do is set the setter,
mm-hmm.
because they don't ever get seen as a hitter.
Yeah.
They don't, if they've got a roll, like I'm 6 feet tall, setter, ran at 5'1", and I played beach my entire life, outdoor. And so I have all kinds of little shots and stuff like that. I don't hit the ball hard. But in a men's volleyball match, if I dug the ball and I was in the front row, or if I was in the back row, almost 100% of the time I could score on a short little roll shot or a roll shot to the corner, because nobody had seen my arm swing except for those 3 swings. And we see it all the time. If you have a setter who can bang or a setter who can swing, there's real advantage to getting that ball back to the setter, because they're just something that people haven't seen. And it's the same reason why baseball has gone away from letting their pitchers pitch to the same batter 3 times. There's just like almost a hard and fast rule. If they see them 3 times, then they know what's happening. But if they can get them just twice, then the pitcher's always in the advantage. And so if you've got a setter who can compete at the net, then finding a way to get them the ball, especially out of system, is a real value. And I think that you shouldn't look at them as just not an option, unless they really aren't an option.
Right. Yeah, and for those who are old enough, and I'm guessing there are a few of those on the attendee list, you might remember when Misty May set for Long Beach. If she dug the ball, they set her. It was a design play, and she was highly effective. Highly effective. Right. And I'm sure all of her opponents knew that she was going to get the ball, and she would still get kills. So
Yeah.
Go for it. Whatever works for your team.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, Rodrigo had been the one who sent in a bunch of questions ahead of time by email, and he assures me that we have covered them all. So I think we're good for signing this one off. I know some of you have some blocking related questions. I am working on setting up a blocking specific conversation with Bob Bertucci and Mark Lebedew, which could be really interesting. So I've tried to save some of those that are more specifically blocking for that conversation. But thanks for turning up.
I see the one from John. More than answer those questions specifically, I think the larger issue is not if outsides can block, it's if we train them to block. And so when you're training, it's really easy to get focused on blocking the outside and blocking the opposing team's middle. And once you train it, then they'll be better at it. And but I think as an outside hitter, a lot of times we're like, you have to pass and you have to serve and you have to attack in system, you have to attack out of system, you have to attack tempo sets, you have to play defense, you got to play off blocker, and then blocking is like the last thing down the list for the outside. And then they're busy doing something else while we're working with the middles and the right sides. That's a really
exactly.
Right? Like middles and right sides and setters, you guys are over with us. And so
Yes.
rather than answer your question specifically, I don't know that that's super, like those are all very situational questions, but I think that anybody can be trained to do it the right way. I just think that we tend to avoid training it because of the level of responsibilities that a left side attacker specifically has.
Agreed. All right, we'll wrap it up there.
Thanks, John.
Thanks
I
a lot.
appreciate it.
Jeff, thanks everybody for turning up.